Welcome to the workshop number 5 in USG's strategic planning process. Today, we're going to be focusing on USG's fiscal model. We are going to be recording this session, so heads up everyone. And Karen or Aaron, if you want to start the recording, that would be great. I'd like to start off by, as always, thanking my co-chair in the strategic planning process, Professor Ike Leggett, for joining us today. Ike, would you like to say any words of welcome to the workshop team?
Yes, Anne, thank you. And thanks for all the participants today. This is an important workshop because much of what we've tried to focus on in some way or another will involve our ability to predict, to plan, and to provide a platform for expansion in the future. And the financial model, I think, is an underpinning of that. And when you look at the hedgehog and the things that we've talked about in the past, you'll see the third item there really talks to the efforts to ensure financial stability, evaluating our resources, and all the things that we need in order to go forward. And so much of what we've talked about in prior sessions will be connected to this in a very meaningful way. And so I'm delighted that we have some of the participants here, many of who have talked about this subject in the past, and I think are going to provide us with some insights about potentially what we can do in order to ensure that we have the model that we think that would allow us to go forward in the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ike. Really appreciate it. As with all of our workshops, the goal today is to inject new ideas and challenge our thinking across the broad USG community, and for each of us to bring those new ideas into the strategic planning process as we work to plan for and build USG 2.0. Today, we're going to be joined by 3 very exciting guests who will share their experience, their insight, and their expertise prioritizing and creating new fiscal models in higher education. Before I introduce our first guest speaker who will share a mission moment, I'd like to first recognize the student volunteers who will be supporting Jamboards throughout our discussions today. Jorge Argueta, Diane Dow, and Alyssa Barrios. Thank you so much to our 3 students for their support today. Now we're going to kick off our workshop with our mission moment. And I'd like to first of all introduce the Honorable Mike Knapp. He is co-founder and CEO of SkillSmart. He is vice chair and a member of the executive committee for the USG Board of Advisors, chair of the Board of Trustees of Montgomery College, and former member of the Montgomery County Council. Mike's vast leadership and partnership across the county and his deep commitment and dedication to building a robust educational ecosystem that meets the needs of all students and drives the economy provides deep insights for the work ahead that we have here in building a fiscal model for USG. Mike, we look forward to your mission moment.
Well, thank you very much, Anne. I appreciate it. And really, I'm just going to build upon what Ike just shared, because I think how he laid that out is exactly what's critical about today's discussion. That this discussion is a foundational element. And so, the reason we're really here today, and the reason we contribute our time to USG is really it's about the students, right? It's to provide opportunity and support students so they can achieve their academic goals and find the success for themselves, and ultimately help grow our community and expand our economy. And what we've recognized over time, that USG has shown that our unique model of academic partnership and support, and really with the focus on student support, can achieve tremendous student success and outcomes for a very diverse student population. The strategic planning process is our time to articulate the community's vision to address what we think we need as a county going forward. And what we found in the JCR report process that I shared with Ellen a couple of years ago, and that I participated in as well, I think is still very true today, that the success of our strategic plan and ultimately that of USG is going to rest on our ability to have partners who can move nimbly with us to meet the specific education needs of the community, and that we have to have autonomy to find those right partners who can bring the programming that we need. But the second part of that is a fiscal model that's going to provide a sustainable, scalable set of resources that will allow us to provide that educational programming and student support. because we know those two pieces go hand in hand ultimately to allow our students to be successful. And the purpose of today's meeting is really to explore the options for that model. And so I can submit that we are a unique model within the system and within higher education. And that was one of the challenges we ran into in the JCR. And so this is going to require some creativity, but also there's some parts of it that are just going to require some hard work and some advocacy. And that I think as we look at this, that we've got to figure out how to include some combination of these following elements. That we really look at how do we recognize and increase the state funding to USG so we can be in a position to effectively purchase the academic programs and support services that we need that scale based on our student population, and really begin to look at what should our state funding really be, what's the right number, and come up with a mechanism that allows us to do that, that then also recognizes how when our population grows, that number can also grow. I think we also ought to be thinking about what kind of partnership do we do with the county. We ought to be looking at, as the provider of the 4-year degree in Montgomery County, what do we do with the county to ensure that ecosystem and that pathway is there, and what resources perhaps are there that are unique to the county that would support that 4-year degree programming effort. We've also talked about this at some of our other discussions, looking at new partnerships that may provide additional revenue sources. And I think that that's something that's really exciting to think about how we explore too. And I don't want that to be kind of the shiny object, because I think that, and if you look at budgets in most other places, that's a 5-10% of an overall budget. That's not the core that you're building off of, but it gives you the resources to kind of do some really cool and innovative things. And so while I think that's exciting, I think that's kind of icing on the cake. It's not the place we begin that discussion. And then looking at an efficient model for shared services. What's the best way to provide the services that we need, but other institutions need as well, and think about the way to do that so that we can scale more efficiently. And so with that, I think it's a critical discussion today, because no matter how lofty or aspirational our strategic plan is, and it's Montgomery County, so we generally get really lofty and really aspirational, without the resources and the ability to direct those resources, we're ultimately not going to, the plan won't be successful, and we at USG won't be successful. And so this, I think, to Ike's point, is a critical foundational element to being able to do this and do this well. And so I thank you for the opportunity to share a couple minutes with you, and I look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you so much, Mike. Thank you for co-chairing the JCR report, and thank you for all you do for USG as well. So let me just kick off the discussion here with just a few points. Why a new fiscal model for USG? You've heard from Ike and you've heard from Mike why this is so important. The JCR report that has been referenced, this is a report that was conducted under the direction of the joint chairs of the budget committees of the Maryland General Assembly. It's known as the Report on Ensuring the Fiscal Viability of the Universities at Shady Grove. And it highlights the critical need for a new funding model that ensures the long-term fiscal viability of USG. And as part of our strategic planning process, it is essential that USG 2.0 is funded and supported in a sustainable manner, with a model that grows the resources as we grow and that aligns with the core responsibilities and services and activities we provide that are central to the USG mission. We've had a lot of conversations around this model since the JCR report, since kicking off the strategic planning process. And you've heard Mike reference, there's a lot of discussion about, should it be a larger base budget from the state? Should there be funding from multiple sources like the county, the federal government, grants, foundations, funding directly tied to services that we provide to our partners and to students or in partnership with others? These are all fascinating possibilities. The point I want to drive home at the start of this workshop is that perhaps the most important takeaway from all these conversations and central to our discussion today is that we need to be clear about what we are building first, and then how the model needs to be built to support that work. So we can't put the fiscal model ahead of what we plan to do, but in keeping in mind what Mike and Ike have just reminded us of, we also have to be realistic in what we can do and what can be funded as well. So with those kind of points of insight and caution, let's start off with our first guest, Rick Stasloff, who is Senior Partner, RPK Group, and a return Innovation Fellow to our workshops. You'll recall that MJ and Rick led our innovation workshop. So Rick, we're excited to learn from you today. Take it away.
Terrific. Thank you, Ann. Thank you, Mike, for kicking us off. Really looking forward to sharing from some of our work and experience, but I know that I'll be learning a lot from all of you along the way. So thank you for having me back. We want to kick off here and I think create some context around sustainable business models. So before we get to USG and its model and what it could be and where it might take you, thought we'd create this framework in how we think about both the traditional ways we think about business model and is that working or not? And if not, how might we start to move towards a new model that achieves sustainability? So next step, we'll take a look quickly on the next slide, just looking at our agenda at that traditional model and why it's not working. And then we'll look at some components in terms of what makes up a sustainable business model. What are the right questions we need to be asking ourselves? What's really the roadmap to go achieve it? And then finally, we'll have some examples in terms of case studies, in terms of what sustainable business models have looked like for other institutions, other systems, other organizations. I know we're going to go deeply into some case study examples after my sharing here, and I'm looking forward to learning from that. Next slide. So the traditional higher ed business model. Where are we in the current moment across higher education? I think this model that we've had in place really since the 1960s, right, has not evolved that much over time. And it strikes me that coming out of the pandemic and all of that created in terms of urgency and change, most of the energy that I'm seeing in higher ed really is focused on getting back to normal, which I read means, could we please go back to March 2020? And we all know we have to really be moving forward, right? So in the current model, where are most organizations and institutions living? Well, most of the way we earn a living is from those public funding sources. Even within that, as we think about budget models, most of those are sort of iterative models, right? Cost plus. We basically look at what was the budget last year, plus or minus, what's the state going to give us, plus or minus what fees might bring in or tuition. And then if we have gaps, we look to increase pricing to cover that. Really not a lot of attention around where I want to focus our attention today around the cost side of the equation, efficiencies, return on investment, and how do we create more diverse revenue streams to really build towards a sustainable model and get our hands on the wheel. So if the current traditional model is not really cutting it, we think, if it really doesn't reflect where USG might go, what could a more sustainable model look like? And what's driving our search for more sustainable models today? So let's look at the next slide. A couple of these slides we introduced during our innovation session. So for some of you who have seen them before, maybe it'll sink in a little deeper. For others, I hope this provides some context before we get more deeply into how to create sustainable models. So I always think it's important to pull back and address some of the why questions. Higher ed has been given some pretty big jobs to do in terms of maintaining access. We want more people to get through the door. We want to do that in ways that reflect equity, but we really want students to get to the finish line, right? And have a completion or achieve whatever their life goals are. Those are big jobs. How do we do those in a world in which we see a decline in public funding? We have declines in enrollment. There's price sensitivities. I think that demands that we have to move from this emphasis on spending, which is where we currently live, to one on investment and return on investment. In essence, how do we get more for the resources we already have and position them to help us achieve shared future vision and to generate further resources to reinvest in our organizations? That's going to require some new data, some new analysis, true, but really it's going to require a shift in culture, I think, in how we consider our business models and how they support mission and student success. Next slide. So I talked about ROI, or return on investment. It's probably worthwhile touching base on what we mean by ROI and probably just as importantly, what we don't mean. So there's three key things that we've seen in a decade plus of work with RPK around building ROI models. One is this holistic understanding of resources. I find that when we get into new initiatives, we tend to focus on the new resources, right? Additional grant funding or additional resources from the state. And we don't think holistically around all the resources we have at our disposal, particularly people and time and what they're doing with time. That helps us better connect into what's possible from a system perspective, from shared service models, and really understand how we drive towards greater efficiency. Secondly, is this focus on unit cost. In my now 4th decade working in higher ed finance, we tend to look within our budgets at very macro level, total revenue, total expense, and we don't really apply our spending to outcomes and productivity. So for example, think about at an institutional level, looking not just at total spending or total spending on instruction, but thinking about what's our cost for a completion? That is, what does it cost to get a student to the finish line? How is that changing over time and why? And what are the levers that we have available? Finally, is this connection from the business model into student success and really more fully into mission. And I think historically, there's been a little bit of a pushback, right? As we've talked about business models and ROI, sometimes we hear people say, well, I care about students and their success. I don't care about the business model. Helping people see that these things are actually very linked and that designing a sustainable business model really speaks to our ultimate goals and our most passionate goals around student success and mission. So I think that takes us then into a deepening on the next slide into ROI and recognizing that ROI means different things for different stakeholders, right? So if you're a student, you're focused on getting to the finish line, reducing the time to degree, reducing the number of excess credits, reducing the cost to achieve that goal. Institutional ROI probably does focus a bit more on the bottom line and having resources for reinvestment. On a system level, we might think more about reducing duplication of effort, this creation of shared service models. We're going to hear more about this later in our session today. And then at the highest level, at a state or a national level, I think this focus on supporting the workforce and being good stewards of resources. So ROI has different meanings at different levels with different stakeholders. Final thought to set some context then around this shift to an IR lens on the next slide. I think that historically, we have lived more on what I would call the revenue side of the equation in our organizations. That is, in response to ever increasing price, we want to increase financial aid. We want to drive more philanthropy. We ask state and local governments for more resources. Important, but what we don't look at it, why does it cost what it costs to offer quality higher education to begin with? And what might we do about it? And so how do we understand the portfolio of programs we're offering to make sure they are truly responsive to demand from students and demand from employers? How do we think about all the support services we offer to figure out how to create shared service models, both inside our organizations and across systems? How do we think about greater transparency and accountability to actually figure if we're on our strategic pathways and what course adjustments are needed? So by shifting to the cost side of the equation and understanding what it takes to deliver quality higher ed, we can start to get more for the resources we already have. And we can start to think about building different models that let us get our hands on the wheel and create sustainability going forward. So a few things to keep in mind as we talk about business models in general. So why don't we go a little bit deeper now into actually creating a sustainable business model? What's the roadmap? Next slide. So there's really 4 key things I wanted to share today that I found are important. Looking at shared future vision, creating a strategic platform, developing very clear service lines, and ultimately doing good modeling so that we don't just hope that our business model works, but we can actually test it, define success, develop good metrics to help us see if we're driving towards that success. So thing 1, next slide, creating a shared future vision, starting with the end in mind. I loved, and Mike, your comments at the very outset about, let's be clear about what we're building first, right? A business model is only as good as what you want to use it for as a tool to drive towards your end result. And if I see institutions and organizations get off track around their strategic approaches and really their success overall in their model, very often it's because we don't have leadership clearly point to what we want to go become, so that we can understand and get more externally focused in making sure that we're not just doing the job we want to do, but we're doing the job that needs to be done to serve students, the workforce, our surrounding community. So really coming up with this shared future vision, and you all have already spent time on this, and I know this will be further developed. For example, this idea of USG as an innovation hub, I find personally really resonates and serves a clear role within the system. And so that will be critical then as you launch into your strategy planning, but it will also really feed the business model that gets developed. Any of us could develop a very robust business model, but if it doesn't take us where we want to go, who really cares, right? So connecting the business model to strategy. Next slide. The second key point was about developing what I've come to call strategic platforms. Candidly, strategic planning has kind of gotten a bad name, I think, in higher ed, and because of the way it's often done, and because the end result can often be really very tactical. It can really be, how do we do what we're already doing a little bit better every year over the next 5 years? Should institutions, organizations seek to optimize? Of course. But really, if we're going to speak to strategy, we've got to take it up to another level. We found thinking about strategic platforms can help with that in terms of what's the shared future vision? What are the probably 3 or 4 key things we must do to achieve it? What will get done? How will we know if we're successful? And what are the resources we need to bring to bear to make that happen? So being able to have a strategic platform that is literally on one page helps us to think about how we focus on achieving shared future vision. Next slide. I'm going to spend a little bit more time then thinking about service lines. And I think this is really where it starts to take us into our fiscal models, right? A lot of time when we think about fiscal models, it can feel like it's just about the numbers. And do the numbers add up in a way that we can at least get to 0 in the bottom line, or maybe have some resources left over at the end of the day to reinvest? And a service line mentality, I think, takes us into a different direction where really demand, mission, strategy meets the business model and sustainability. So service lines is something that we borrowed from really hospital healthcare world. If you think about hospitals and their evolution over, really 25, 30 years now, and we see hospitals provide a range of service, but maybe an emphasis on cancer center or heart institute or women's health, right? And so service line is really a way to think about your products and services. How do they connect to external demand? And how do we bring resources to bear so that at the end of the day, we know, how do we earn a living? Where does the money come from and where does it go? And understanding where those net revenue drivers are. Now, let's talk about net revenue drivers for a minute. Does that mean we should only do things that are profitable, that generate positive net revenue? Sometimes when you talk about ROI, it can feel that way. And I think that's what drives some of the pushback or the fear, right? And I would be here to tell you as unabashedly, an ex-CFO and a finance data guy, that the answer is no. We don't want to only do things that drive positive net revenue, because there are many things we do from a mission perspective, right, that are critical. We need to do enough things that drive positive net revenue so that we understand how we're going to be able to earn a living and, quite frankly, subsidize those things that may need to be subsidized for mission purposes. So service lines really helps us focus and move away from what do we want to offer and really get more into what are we being asked to do. So next slide. I think a way into that then around that service line approach is really just 4 key questions. Who are we serving? Now, here I say, who are our customers? Sometimes people don't like that language. So we could think about who are our stakeholders? Who are the people we need to deliver services to? Secondly, what do they need? Third, what are we good at? Where are our strengths? And then the fourth is, how do you combine of all the things you could do that respond to needs? Which one of those provide these mission and market opportunities, right? Where you're actually driving revenue, creating more diverse revenue streams so that you have sustainability and you have more control, quite frankly, on the resources that you're generating. So how does that all come together? Thought I'd bring you just a couple snapshots now for some sort of mini case studies that maybe would help to make this even more tangible. Next slide. First was a project we were engaged in recently for a long-standing partner of ours, the American Council on Education. Most of you in higher ed probably have heard of them, ACE. And they were really looking to change their membership model. You know, you do things for the better part of 100 years. You kind of get a little stuck in how you do it. And so the need to provide a more cost-effective, a more flexible approach to building capacity across higher ed. And we worked together to launch what has now become the Engage platform. So what was interesting about that is from a business model perspective is it really brought a whole new revenue stream to ACE in terms of how they would choose to offer content, create community of practice, create networks. Secondly, it allowed for a more flexible approach, you know, moving away from the get on a plane, go to a hotel, sit in a hotel room, listen to somebody stand in front of the room kind of model. And it really brought in and respected what was really the shift that we were all seeing in our personal and professional lives towards the way we were learning in more of a social media kind of approach. So this was done with very careful consideration of how to build on current strengths around brand identity and content to respond to new demand in the market to have a more flexible and more hybrid model for learning and professional development that created community. And third, to create new revenue streams that actually help to feed the whole organization. Next slide. Another example I thought might be interesting to look at is on the foundation side. We worked with a foundation recently called KnowledgeWorks, pretty traditional foundation that was providing grants out into the K-12 and higher ed space to look at personalized learning options and really help the foundation start to develop new revenue streams for itself to take the learnings it was generating and actually help organizations to start to implement and execute on the action plans that they were developing. So they really moved into a bit more of a consultative advisory model for the foundation itself to help organizations across the country, which again generated new revenue, but it also created a new learning model for them as they were executing and helped them understand where the research needed to go around creating personalized models across really a P-16 kind of approach. The final one I thought I'd share is in a system perspective, some recent work we were involved in across the Vermont State Colleges system. What did we see here as the problem to be solved? Well, not a whole lot of leveraging of the system, right? Not really shocking that our systems don't do that very often in higher ed, and really an unsustainable business model that as public funding was declining, more and more of a reliance on tuition and fee revenue, but some real top end ceilings they were bumping into in terms of pricing. This resulted in Vermont electing, and they are now moving forward with consolidating all the four-year institutions into one institution across the whole system. There will no longer be four business departments. There will be one business department and one business curriculum. And they will have common approaches there to create shared service models, both on administrative service delivery as well as academic delivery. So really looking very hard at the cost side of the equation to create efficiencies that are market oriented to allow them to right size the entire system and create a new sustainable model for them to go after. Next slide. Final piece of the equation then, you remember where there were four around shared future vision, where are we going, service line creation, the creation of strategic platforms, and now looking at the analytics side to understand how do I earn a living, really getting down into the details of what the service line offerings are, what does it cost me to offer them, what's the likely revenue, and therefore where is that net revenue? Again, not because everything we do will generate net revenue, but we probably need greater transparency around where the money comes from and where it goes, so that now we can confidently project forward. And it means we can make bigger bets and bigger investments on things that are likely to not only support mission, but will drive a more sustainable business model. So, final two slides. Thank you for staying with us to this point. I wish I could tell you exactly what's going to happen in the days and weeks and months and years ahead. But as I think about what the future is likely to hold for higher ed, I think there's a few key things that for me come to mind. One, I do think there is this idea of how do we get more from the resources we already have? And I don't think that's a function of telling everybody to work harder or longer. I think it's about making decisions around where we put time, effort, and energy and what we get for that. Secondly, I think we're going to have an increase in transparency and accountability. And so that means not only the creation of defining what success looks like, but great metrics and greater sharing across our organizations about where we are in our pathways towards strategy. Third is this more externally based approach in that our success as an industry in higher ed is really increasingly going to be determined based on outcomes and our connection to the world of work. And finally, I think we're going to have to resolve this disconnect, I think, between a public and a private goods model, meaning higher ed, in terms of who we serve, we have largely shifted to what I would call a private goods model, but we still have this business model that pretends that it's kind of the mid-60s. Those two things are going to have to catch up with each other. And I think we're going to be forced to, and we want to do it in a way that we have more control over and not be forced to do that. Final thought then, in terms of what does this all mean in terms of where we are and where we might be going? And I think there are these two curves happening at the same time in higher ed now. On the left side, we have this need to optimize, right? How do we adopt more of this ROI lens and streamline our academic portfolios to better respond to student demand and external demand from employers? How do we have the right data and analysis in place to understand where we are? How do we start to shift resources towards the things that actually take us over to our next curve where we can invest in innovation and to be driving towards shared future vision? And so the challenge is, I don't think we can live on one curve or the other. What I've seen over many decades in higher ed is we can sometimes just optimize within our current resources. Well, that's great, but it doesn't tell you what you want to go become. But the opposite's true too. If we just blue sky things and talk about where we want to go, but it's not grounded in the reality of where we are today and the resources we have to work with, it really becomes very hard to build a foundation that gets stronger to leap over towards shared future vision. And so I think what I want to leave you with is this both and strategy of Universities of Shady Grove building on current strengths, considering what service line offerings can be, how they generate net revenue that ultimately creates a sustainable business model, but designing all of that towards shared future vision and the Shady Grove that you want to become. So thank you for giving me a few moments to share from some of our experience across higher ed writ large. Happy to dive into any questions people have, or we can keep going in terms of the next pieces of our conversation.
Thank you so much. That was awesome. So much to think about. There's a quick question in the chat.
Sure.
Rick, if you want to take it, it says, can you give more clarification about what you mean by a public versus private goods model?
Sure. So, when you think about a public goods model, this idea that, hey, education is good for everybody, right? And we should, as a society, invest in it, because if Anne gets her education, that helps me, right, as a citizen, because she's able to contribute more. And if we go back really not too far in time, 50, 70 years, we see that we operated largely on that public goods model. Easy way to think about that. Where did the resources come from historically in higher ed to support public higher education? They really came from state, local governments. And there was a time, most of us probably remember, when 70+%, almost 80% of funding came from state, local governments. Maybe 20, 30% came from tuition and fees. Today, of course, that's completely flipped, right? And so it means that the way we earn a living has changed. So under that private goods model, I think about the language we use with students even. We often talk about students as customers. We say, invest in yourself. We say, the money and time you spend in your education will be the biggest investment you will ever make in your life. That's a bit now shifting to a private goods model that says the benefit is on you, the customer, the student. And I think the mismatch is that that transition has already happened. A lot of us don't like that, right? There's parts of it, candidly, I don't like. But the truth is that in terms of who we're serving and who's paying for that service is largely the student. And that student is really much more like a customer today. When you think, though, about how we deliver services, I still think we deliver services as if it's a public goods model, meaning we can do a lot of different things and we don't really have to pay attention to what they cost and what we get for that cost. And that's where I think the mismatch starts to happen. And we have to have better alignment then in terms of the services we offer and how we offer them, so that it really meets more the demand coming from students and the demand coming from our employers. So hopefully that.
And I had a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, Ike.
Yeah. Rick, thanks for your presentation. Let me break it down to a more of a practical reality or model. You mentioned a number of times about return on investment. It's essentially making an investment in order to better position yourself to be more efficient in the future and to generate additional revenue. Oftentimes, to do that, you need to put forward a plan that requires an investment up front. You sort of get to what comes first, the chicken or the egg. I want to, and oftentimes the only choice that you have is to prioritize resources that you already have in order to invest for the future to generate revenue or a more sustainable model going forward. That's a pretty difficult challenge to make, because in education, you have to offset sometimes things that you've traditionally done in order to have the resources, the platform to invest for the future. And that, to me, is where you generally run into that log jam. I want to be more efficient, meaning that some of the things that we're doing are not that profitable or not that worthwhile in the eyes of some. I want to provide a model for the future, and I therefore need to provide resources, provide a platform, and a better avenue for investment to go forward. And that's the conflict that I oftentimes see.
Sure. Well, I'm glad you're raising that and just saying it out loud, because I'm sure people on our session today are thinking that. Now, I spent a lot of years early in my career working at the Maryland General Assembly. And, very often I find across all public agencies all over the country, right, we often come in and say, can I please have more resource? And there's a presumption that therefore it's a good thing. What we don't often say is, invest in me, and here's what you're going to get on your investment. And don't take my word for it. Let me show you what will happen so you can hold me accountable. And here's what I'm doing with the resources I already have, right? We're going to stop doing this. We're going to do more of that. We're going to become more efficient here. So now I'm really in partnership with you around that investment. So I want to be clear that there is still a critical role for our public entities to invest in us and the work we do. I think where we can move our own models forward is by showing more of this ROI lens and what we'll get from the state or the county's investment in us, and how we're being good stewards of the resources we already have. I think that's where we can link together then in driving towards sustainability that achieves mission.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you.
Let's just open it up. If people have questions, what did you hear? What do you have questions about, and how does it apply to USG?
Well, Anne, this is Mary. I just wanted to set the stage a bit in terms of what Shady Grove currently does. Some of the folks on the call may or may not be familiar with the model. As many of you know, we're not responsible for the students or the faculty or the staff that our partners bring. And as a result, we don't receive tuition dollars. So typically in a traditional institution, and Rick, you might want to speak to that, is that tuition can often feed as enrollment grows. There might be an opportunity, even though there's state-based resources in some states, even states' resources grow based on enrollment. Shady Grove doesn't really have that currently in its model system to regenerate the investment into new resources and new services. So that's been just to set the stage of an understanding across this group that's here, we don't currently set up as a traditional institution to have those same type of resources you might think are available to be used. And Rick, I don't know if you wanted to add to that a bit.
Sure. No, I think that's important. It's essential to note, right? In terms of what are the opportunities we have to earn a living. And so as you think about how do we open ourselves up to new possibilities, we've talked already, so just to mention it, around thinking about being good stewards, thinking about efficiencies, meaning how could we pull back resources we already have to allow for investment? More to the point, where might be some of these fee for service opportunities? What are the services we can provide that we're good at, that people need, that they'll actually pay us for? So let's be open to those revenue streams, and even thinking about what possible revenue sharing opportunities would be. If Shady Grove is acting value for its partners, is there a rev share opportunity where a piece of that revenue stream gets carved off because we're adding value, right? And everybody benefits. So I don't mean to make that exclusive, but that would be a different way to start to think about a revenue model and the services that support that revenue model going forward.
But Rick, I can't resist because I have a healthcare background. When you talked about the service lines, can
Yeah.
you and I will tell you, in healthcare, with each service line, there's contribution margins that are measured, right? So some service lines generate a margin and some
Yes.
don't, right? Can you give examples of service lines in the higher
Sure.
education?
So let's look within work that we've done, for instance, in the membership world in higher ed or the foundation world, where you might have a service line around consulting. You might have one around meetings, networking, creating community, right? Where each of those two, just to use those examples, have separate revenue streams. And you can start to tie costs to it. So you can literally understand, and thank you for saying that, Paul, what the contribution margin is and what are the levers impacting that. So now you see, how do you want to change the use of resources? Where do you want to invest and make bigger bets, right, across those? Or we're helping to build a number of research centers right now at some R1s, helping them think about service lines, for instance, around particular grant activities by sector in criminal justice, K-12, et cetera. And so what are the needs? What's the revenue? What's the expense? And that helps them figure out how they're earning a living. And over time, whether they want to start to shift resources around. So that's a more market-based, sector-based approach.
Quick question for you. You started out the conversation talking about our institutions, and they're all looking to get back to March of 20, and when the pandemic kind of changed the world for us. So the word nostalgia kind of jumps into my head as to how these systems tend to operate. And when you ask them about the things when you're trying to figure out how you get them to stop doing things and to not be so nostalgic about how they do planning. Talk about some experiences you might have had with institutions who have embraced change from that level versus this is how we do it. And we're going to continue to do it because there's no other really good way of doing it.
No, it's a critical question right now, Kevin. You're right. And, let's just say out loud, look, it's human to want to go back to what you know, right? There's a comfort around it. And there tends to be fear around change, and there's a fair amount of loss. So, a few things. One, I think it requires very strong leadership to be able to point towards where we could go. This starts to address the fear question, right? Now it's not just about changing, it's about changing towards something. Secondly, I've seen the need to really move towards more of what I'll call a data-informed culture, right? If we stay caught in what is more the emotional, though human reaction to what we're doing today, and we don't have data to understand, is it really being responsive to the students or employers we serve? And how would we know? Having the data doesn't automatically get everybody on board, but it starts to push people, nudge them towards that change piece. And then I think we've got to be very clear about strategy and that process for change so that as we drive towards new shared future vision, we can start to get quick wins. We can start to communicate it under a change management process. So I think the fundamental question, Kevin, is really how do good leaders help people get focused on the job to be done? Meaning, how do we not just talk about what we want to do, but talk about how we are in service to the students and the employer base that we serve? That's how I start to see the needles change.
So do you see, I mean, one of the things that I always found frustrating just in business and dealing with clients was they always wanted to tell me what to do versus manage and evaluate what I do.
Yeah.
Because again, they've given to me a requirement, and the job for them at that point is to make sure it is the right requirement, and then to manage that requirement and to evaluate whether or not I've given them what they wanted. And I'm trying to think about how we teach project management to the ends of, it's amazing to me how many different words we've used to describe trying to do project management, all the different models out there. We teach the hell out of it. We still don't do it. And trying to figure out how that plays into when you think about how financial and fiscal models come together in terms of how do you manage to the activity you're trying to get accomplished.
Yeah, absolutely essential. And I think 3 key things that I'd share there. One, we talked earlier about transparency and accountability. I'm often struck as we work with schools, colleges, institutions, universities, systems, that when we ask the question, what will good look like? Very often people are silent, right? So we launch a new program and we're excited about it, but how many students are going to come and by when? And what are the resources we need? And will this cover its cost or not? Or you launch a new center, a new program, whatever it is. We don't clearly put a stake in the ground to say, here's what's good will look like. Here's how you will know. And here's how I'm going to communicate with you so you can hold me accountable. When you do that, 1, you create trust. 2, people, I find, back off a little bit from that sort of regulatory oversight perspective, because there's a sense of, you've got this, and I know when I'm going to intervene to make sure you're on the right pathway. So I think that's an important part of that whole communication piece around stakes in the ground and showing that you're thinking about this from an outcomes-based perspective. Conversation shifts.
And just my final comment on that is my response oftentimes to that question was, at the end, what are you going to thank me for?
There you go. I like that. And here's another final piece to that is, how do we say up front what the exit strategy will be? So higher ed is terrible about failing forward. And you know what? There's going to be things we try that don't work. And we've got to create a space where that's okay. And we know, oh, if this doesn't happen by year X, we probably should stop doing this. And now let's put people, time, and money towards something else that we think does bring us forward. So thinking about exit strategies and failing forward is, I think, all part of that continuum of transparency and accountability. Thank you.
Maybe one more question before we go to our next guest speaker. Anybody?
Ann?
Yeah, PJ.
Hi. I'll get right to the point. Rick, in your work with higher ed institutions around the country, have you ever run into anything like a USG model where you do not have, you're not a degree granting institution, you're not collecting and retaining tuition? I mean, that's what makes us, I think, unique, challenging, difficult.
Yeah, so it is a unique model. There's no question, but I do think there's some things that we can learn from. You know, when I think about the Da Vinci Center for Innovation, Virginia Commonwealth University is developing a model to find innovation and feed it back out to the system. If you look at shared service models, again, we're going to hear some good examples. I think next, I think about the Claremont colleges is a great example. Now, private system of institutions, but still totally outsourced to each other all of their administrative services, which they then sell back to each other, right, on a unit cost basis. So we do have examples of places being a center for innovation, for entrepreneurship, or for service provision, right, that lowers cost, improves quality, that actually lets everybody benefit from a sort of centralized service model. So I do think there are some things we can learn from, and happy to keep working with the team here around those models.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thanks for the great questions and the great discussion. We're going to move to our next guest speaker. I'd like to introduce Kathy Ulibarri. She is the Chief Executive Officer of K. Ulibarri Consulting and Collaborative for Higher Education Shared Services, otherwise known as CHESS. Kathy is also joining us from New Mexico today. So Kathy, it is a delight to have you here, and we're really excited to learn from you.
Great, thank you so much. I appreciate being here, and I'm happy to share with you the story from the land of enchantment. Today, what I wanted to do was share with you a little bit about the journey, what led to the creation of the Collaborative for Higher Education Shared Services, what we call CHESS. It's a story born out of crisis and circumstances that I want to share with you, and then hopefully provoke some thinking about innovative ways that universities at Shady Groves might move forward. Before I dive in, though, I have to say, prior to this, Rick and I have never met. But if I had had an opportunity to sit down before this and say, Rick, here's what I'd like you to talk about to lay a foundation to really describe what our presidents are thinking about, that would have been it. It was a great presentation, and I really appreciate it. And it does lay a great foundation for the CHESS story. Next slide, please. So to really understand our story, I need to share with you a little bit about New Mexico. New Mexico is the 5th largest state in terms of land mass. We are 37th in the nation in terms of population. Our total population is 2.1 million people. But I can tell you there's a tiny little blue county towards the middle of the map there. That is Bernalillo County with Albuquerque. And about 50% of the population is centered in that tiny county. So about 1 million people fill in all of the other counties in our state. I can say Las Cruces down in the south is growing and working to catch up, but otherwise we have a very centralized population. And we're 46th in the nation in terms of population density. And from the map, this is a map reflecting the vote from the last presidential election. You can see we're politically divided. On national maps, we show up as a blue state, always solidly blue because we have a population center, that tiny county that's blue. But regionally, politically, there are some extreme differences that ultimately are very important to our story. We're also a majority minority state, 47% Latinx and 10.6% Native American. Next slide, please. Historically, the higher ed landscape has been one in which the New Mexico legislature has really invested in higher education to the best of their ability. And prior to the surge in online instruction, our state invested in physical locations for access to higher education throughout our sparsely populated state. So we have 29 public institutions of some form, and that's not counting a myriad of private, both nonprofit and proprietaries in our state. But 29 publicly funded colleges and universities, 7 of those are universities with boards of regents that are defined in our state constitution, appointed by the governor and confirmed by our Senate. We have 2 different forms of community colleges. Independent community colleges, we have 7 of those with locally elected board of trustees, plus the New Mexico Military Institute, which is a combination high school and community college that does have an appointed board of regents. We have branch community colleges that are attached to universities, 10 of those with locally elected advisory boards. And then we have tribal colleges that are federally funded. I'll add that each of those community colleges with a locally elected board of some sort also has a local taxing base. And so there is a local revenue contribution to those institutions. Next slide. So like states across the country, higher education in New Mexico is facing a lot of challenges. Financial challenges, we've never recovered in terms of reductions in state appropriations from the Great Recession in 2008 and on. Like a lot of folks, we're seeing declining enrollments. And in fact, as a result of the pandemic, New Mexico saw some of the largest drops of enrollment in the nation. Because we've dealt with access by building physical campus locations all throughout our state, we have lots of institutions that have large expenditures to maintain systems, particularly enterprise technology solutions. Those solutions are outdated and complicated, and it really came to forbearance with the pandemic when we moved everything to online instruction and realized how clunky our systems were to really meeting the needs of students, particularly outside of the classroom, the advising and wraparound services in a remote fashion. And because so many of our colleges are in very sparsely populated communities, it's really difficult to attract the staff, particularly in the technology areas, to keep systems running and keep colleges moving forward. Politically, our state has looked at that map, looked at the map of all the 29 colleges and said, gee, can we afford to maintain this system of higher education in our state? So there's been a lot of pressure to reduce physical location, move more to online, and frankly, contain higher education in that way. Our politicians are absolutely desiring for us to be more effective in raising educational attainment levels in our state. They're frustrated about students' ability to move seamlessly from one institution to another. I'm sure you're as aware of anyone that our students swirl. They package courses from a variety of institutions and often end up accumulating excess credits in that process on their journey to a degree. And over the years, there have been a number of threats by our legislature to either close institutions. We simply can't afford the cost of maintaining 25 state-funded public institutions in our state. Either closing them or creating a centralized system, as Vermont has done or is working on doing, as a means to curtail costs to the state. And of course, when you're in a state that has this significant red-blue split, the thought of a centralized board that would live in a state capital in a blue community is really outrageous and appalling to those locally elected boards in the red areas of the state. Next slide, please. So, I always like to say out of every threat or crisis comes an opportunity. And that's sort of how this began in New Mexico. So back in 2016, at that time, I happened to be serving as the Vice President for Finance and Operations at Central New Mexico Community College. That is the largest institution in the state of New Mexico. And one day I was sitting in my office at CNM, and in walked the president from Luna Community College, which is a very small college in Las Vegas, New Mexico. It's fairly rural. And I had known this president for a while, and he walked in my office and he sat down and he said, "I need help." CNM was running on the Banner platform, and Luna was on an old, outdated version of Genzabar. And he said, "Kathy, can I contract with you to run my ERP and student information system?" He said, "I can't find people to maintain my system. I can't afford the upgrade. This isn't going to work in my community. And by the way, Luna Community College was one of the institutions in which the legislature was particularly targeting for closure." So, that's an interesting idea. And so I talked with my president about it, and she agreed we could explore it. And what we found was that the Banner system in which CNM was operating was not designed to allow me to set up a separate tenant or collect data with different attributes that would allow me to separate that data between the two institutions without Luna purchasing their own Banner license, which they absolutely could not afford. Nonetheless, it was such an interesting idea that the presidents in the New Mexico Independent Community Colleges, which is an advocacy association for community colleges in the state, they started talking about the idea, and really the impetus for CHESS was born there. Let's go to the next slide. So what is CHESS? The collaborative it's actually a nonprofit corporation that is designed to optimize a groundbreaking partnership of independent educational institutions. They're going to keep their independence, but share tools, talents, and best practices to improve, frankly, the student experience. And support the delivery of high quality education services that advance student success. Right now, we have 5 member colleges. They are Clovis Community Colleges, Central New Mexico, Northern New Mexico College, which is our one university partner, San Juan College, and Santa Fe Community College. And we are in negotiations with 2 other community colleges in our state that are likely to join soon. So in this nonprofit, the bylaws of the nonprofit do say that the president of each of those member institutions sits on and serves as the board of director for the nonprofit. So they're really driving decision making. They're functioning as a system board, but they're doing so in a way that protects and maintains their important locally elected boards, and without the state moving forward with actually the implementation of a system. Next slide. So I wouldn't necessarily suggest that others jump in with as ambitious a goal as CHESS did, but our initial goal has been to align all business processes across member institutions using a single instance cloud-based ERP and student information system while maintaining each college's unique culture and independent governance structure. So we're replacing Banner, we're replacing Genzabar, we're replacing whatever system was in place. But instead of institutions maintaining those on separate servers at each institution, It's going to be managed through a cloud-based system. So our vendor maintains the servers, and we're going to align business processes across colleges. Our colleges talk about the frustration when a registrar leaves Clovis Community College. And it's not always easy to find an experienced registrar willing to move to a community like Clovis, New Mexico. Our institutions don't have the resources necessarily to pay for that talent, the premium required to attract them to a small rural New Mexico community. And yet, other colleges can't jump in and help because even those institutions that were all in the same system, they're all configured so differently that it's apples to oranges. So this is designed to deal with some of those issues. It's anticipated that there'll be some cost savings through reduction in the need for high-priced contractors to maintain systems. More modern systems require less third-party or bolt-on software applications to trick the system into doing what students now expect, and the ability to share talent across institutions. In addition, I think our smaller colleges are really looking at this as a more efficient way or cost-effective way to improve capacity. So to gain access to more sophisticated tools for the benefit of their students, that they couldn't afford to do on their own. And also developing cybersecurity support in a centralized way so that our institutions are protected. And then there's also the idea that this really, in a way, can ultimately transform the student experience. By allowing students to package courses from ME member college to shorten time to degree, and by smoothing the student transfer process, particularly to our member university, because the user experience from an online platform perspective will be identical. And we've talked about, you don't even need to submit an application. You're automatically a student of a member college if you participate in this initiative. Let's go on to the next slide. Our financial model, we do not receive a state appropriation in any form because we are a nonprofit, and that would not be permitted with our anti-donation clause in our state. But what we do is each year we develop a CHESS budget that is ultimately approved by the board of CHESS, which again is the member presidents. We then develop an MOU or a series of MOUs that allocate that budget to the member colleges, and CHESS then invoices the colleges. So we're essentially a service provider for those colleges in areas where it's more cost effective for the college to pay CHESS to take on a service as opposed to doing that service on their own. We do have an annual review process of the factors that drive those cost allocations. There are some leadership related costs that are shared equally across the 5 colleges. So my time, for example, in working with CHESS is shared equally. Whereas things like subscription cost for our products, the student information system, for example, would be shared based on student FTE. Finance and HR modules of our system will be shared based on employee FTE counts, because that is the way in which we are invoiced from the vendor. So that's the basic model. It's invoicing, and the participating institutions contribute, with the efficiencies really then being back at the institution level. One example I like to use is that ultimately we'll get to the point where we centralize some institutional research services. So every college in our group hires 1 to 2 individuals who submit the very same reports to the US Department of Ed, to the National Student Clearinghouse, to our state government agencies. They're all submitting the same things in the same formats, when 1 or 2 individuals could be doing those same things for all of our member colleges. It doesn't mean that necessarily those positions go away at the member colleges. They could, but instead, institutions often look at it as saying, I can get more bang for my buck by having my institutional researchers spend their time doing the business analytics to see how I'm progressing towards strategic goals, as opposed to filling out the same reports to the same entities over and over again. So next slide, please. Really, as I was learning a little bit about Universities of Shady Grove from an outsider looking in, I would say you've got some real strengths to build on here. You've already got existing partnerships with 9 public universities in one location. You've already got a track record of working together on things like academic coaching, career advising, and other areas. So my thought process was really, how do you take this to the next level? What are some other areas you could share in a model where it may not be as much about cost savings for the existing University of Shady Groves, but more cost savings for the participating colleges as a means to become more efficient and improve your return on investment. So opportunities that came to my mind, could there be some efficiencies in place by member universities sharing back office processes like institutional research or payroll or benefits management? I can tell you in accounting, there's nothing about the way one of our member colleges processes the payment on an invoice that is mission defining or culturally defining for that college. They all should be using best practice, yet a mistake in that process certainly negatively impacts the institution reputationally. So what are those areas where they don't impact your reputation and strengths in terms of programmatic offerings, but could be shared across the colleges? Possibly even all opportunities to do some enterprise software sharing. Taking on something like an ERP or a student information system is a huge lift. You certainly wouldn't have to start with anything of that magnitude, but even thinking about things like learning management systems. What would that be like for your students if you were all on a shared learning management system in terms of their comfort and ability to move between institutions, or have you all work together in providing a common experience for students that helps them move through and be more successful? And I'm sure you all will have a lot better ideas about opportunities. But I certainly hope I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about CHESS and our journey. But most of all, I hope it just inspires you to think about some ways you all might work together differently.
Kathy, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. Let's open up the full gallery so everyone can see each other here. And let's open it up for questions, reactions, thoughts that people have.
Well, I'll start with this comment. Thank you for the presentation. It's interesting to see how other states are doing this. I mean, the experience looks a lot different to me than what we're dealing with at USG, but I can certainly see, and again, the opportunity when things get to a point where you really do have to change how you do business. And I guess it just leads me to believe, I don't know that that we've reached that point, that there's enough of a threat operationally or politically for us to really just put the brakes on and rethink everything. The point about efficiencies raises an interesting question for me, though, because in its scale, I'm not sure that we have, if we think about student services as an example and use College Park as an example, they'd be hard pressed to reduce the number. If there was an efficiency that they got students on our campus in degree programs, but do they have enough of them that they would have to put a resource out here to deal with them? And if we're dealing with them, would they reduce their staff on campus by 1 or 2? That would give us that budget to deal with the staff that we had. So that would be one point to think. I'm not sure what efficiencies we'd gain. And because you've got 9 universities with 9 different student accounting systems and fiscal systems, is there an opportunity there at the university system level to think about how that works? Is it one platform? Are they all on 9 different platforms? There are potentially some efficiencies there. But again, the president seemed to have an awful lot of say in how all that works. And others someone like Ellen, who I know I saw, who's on the call, I'd be interested, her perspective on what that looks like at the university system level, if in fact there are efficiencies, if in fact they could mandate some of the systems level things that might yield savings.
This is Ellen. I was actually going to chime in and, if I can, add to Kevin's points. So Kathy, first of all, thank you. I am the finance person for the system, so I was listening and taking lots of notes on your experience. Kevin, to your point, I was thinking the same thing about which direction the efficiencies would move in. And just so I'll do a Mary Lang as she did earlier, just so everybody knows, a lot of the back office services are provided by the University of Maryland College Park to Shady Grove, and they pay a bill to College Park for that. Kevin, where I was thinking about that point though, when you were talking about, does College Park have enough students and programs at Shady Grove, and would they give up a body at the main campus? Probably not. But one of the things we have talked about on occasion is some of the smaller universities in the system who have programs that are of benefit to the students of Montgomery County, who might benefit if, for instance, Shady Grove were to invest in an individual to do, pick your activity. Would the smaller universities be willing to pay to share in resources that are centrally located at Shady Grove? So that's one thought. Kathy, I kind of had the smile when you talked about maybe don't take on ERP first off the bat. We actually are in the midst of doing that. So Kevin, to your point, all of our universities are in the process of upgrading their ERP, and over time, the student information system will follow, but the ERP systems are more mature. And
we'll share notes.
Yeah, well, I've got 5 universities that the system is leading a consolidated implementation effort into one instance.
Yes.
So I'm investing heavily in Clairol because my hair is getting grayer and grayer every day. But so we are taking advantage of that. The other thing we've done is the larger universities who went first are sharing all of their work product, and they set their contracts up to share all their work product, and including the integration contractors. So Kevin, to your point, if you'd have asked me 2 years ago or 3 years ago, I would have said, yep, 12 universities, 9 instances of ERP systems. And not 12, because College Park actually provides ERP services, not only to Shady Grove, but to Eastern Shore, UMCs, and to the system office. And now we're looking at far fewer, so. But I am a big believer in shared services, and Rick, you might appreciate this. We have a ways to go on administrative back office. That's always where people start, and it's a good place to start. But I've always said, as we do that, if we aren't willing to tackle the main business of what we do, which is the academic side, then we will not achieve true, not only cost savings, but improvements in delivery of education.
If I could
Thanks.
just comment on that, Ellen, you know, I was really actually kind of surprised but pleased that our presidents went to that discussion relatively quickly. And they all talked about, you know, the number of times in their smaller communities that they have courses that didn't make because of insufficient enrollment, and the desire to have a platform where one course, one faculty member could be shared across multiple institutions to fill seats in a more efficient way, to help students move through. And they went there really quickly. And that'll be interesting. You're right, the student information system aspects of a lot of the more modern systems aren't as mature. But we did get a commitment from our selected vendor to actually sit on the design team as they're working through making those options available. So we'll see how that emerges.
Kathy, can I ask a question? So there's the efficiencies part of this, and then there's the improving student service part of this, and that's really intriguing to me. And the greatest saving seems to be one of the greatest service opportunities seems to be in linking the community college students to four-year degree possibilities. We are, you know, that is what Shady Grove is all about. Shady Grove, in partnership with Montgomery College and MCPS, are all about that pathway to a four-year degree program, and really trying to accelerate that and trying to find ways to make that smoother, remove the barriers to that, build bridges in that process as well. I'm just imagining, would it ever be possible for Montgomery College and Shady Grove to share a student services, student information services program? I know we share some data, but I don't think it's that deep. But could you talk a little bit about how that, any barriers in that process, any barriers in that data sharing, or, what was it that motivated that ability to really smooth the student process with your four-year college and the community colleges?
Well, we've, again, it's always that legislative pressure in New Mexico. We've had a lot of pressure of legislative analysts looking at data that shows the number of credit hours that students accumulate through the transfer process. And we're fairly new. We have a relatively new common course numbering system. It was really painful to get there in New Mexico, and just a lot of frustration about that. In the survey data that our colleges have done, it's been really clear that the community colleges provide a lot more wraparound student support services than our universities do, particularly our large universities like the University of New Mexico. And so when students transfer, our data showed that when a student graduated from the University of New Mexico, their GPA was typically higher than a native UNM student. But where we ran into trouble was that a community college student was 3 times more likely to drop out before graduation. So as we drilled down on that, we found that it was the cultural difference from the community college having this robust set of wraparound students. They just don't let students fall through the cracks. And then they go to this environment where it's hey, you're on your own. Resources are here, but it's up to you to find them kind of environment that was not helpful, and it was causing students to drop out before ultimately achieving their goal. So our university partner in this initiative feels really strongly that what he wants to use this for is to replicate the support culture that students at community colleges are comfortable with and familiar with at the university level. So not only will the, hey, how do I register for a course on my phone process be identical, but the whole level and structure of support around student services will also be familiar. And he feels strongly that this is going to make him the leader as the destination transfer institution in the state.
Thanks so much, Kathy. It parallels a lot of things that we've tried doing, that we do here at Shady Grove as well. So, but thank you so much. Other questions?
Yeah, hi, this is Elizabeth Fryer. I'm the program director for the TLST program from UMBC. And I spent 15 years teaching at the Claremont colleges. So I have a whole lot of experience with sharing of resources and et cetera, and how that works and how it works well and how it sometimes really doesn't work. The big difference I see with UMBC though is that at Claremont, or like what Kathy was talking about in New Mexico, those institutions are all in on this shared resource program, right? So Graduate University, Claremont Graduate University, they are part of the Claremont colleges. They don't have 90% of their business somewhere else. Whereas at Shady Grove, UMBC has its big toe in Shady Grove, but the vast majority of its emphasis is somewhere else. So I'm not sure how those situations are going to expand, translate into the Shady Grove model, because if it gets too annoying for UMBC, they're just going to pull themselves out.
Yeah.
Right. So I think it's really a very different animal. So I'd like to hear what both Kathy and Richard have to say in terms of that.
Well, if I may, that was a critical issue in New Mexico. So I mentioned that the conversation started with the advocacy group called New Mexico Independent Community Colleges. And that's an association that has 10 member colleges. And not all 10 believed in this model. We had a couple of institutions that said, no, this is making it too easy for our state legislature to form a system. You're going to create the basis of a system, and it'll be really easy for legislature to come in and abolish our boards, and just you've already got the system. Our remaining colleges, the ones who are all in, said, no, we totally disagree with that. We are solving the problem statement that the legislature has put before us. We are essentially locking in and solidifying our locally elected boards by solving the problem before they get to the point of creating a system. So philosophical difference, and it is what led to, instead of New Mexico Independent Community Colleges becoming the vehicle for shared services, some of the colleges peeled off and created a new nonprofit for this purpose. So it's a really important point, and I do believe it has been critical to the success at getting CHESS to the point where it is now, is that we have total buy-in and acceptance by the presidents that are participating.
Rick, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think just building on Kathy's great comments, starting with a coalition of the willing is a great first, maybe third step, right? Smaller, have a win and build on that. I think of some painful experiences I had as a young CFO trying to get 6 institutions to agree to buy 8.5 by 11 white paper. And that took like 6 months. And I remember thinking, I got humbled a little bit. So coalition of the willing, smaller, have a win, and go and build on that. At the same time, I think from a system perspective, as we get smarter about where the shared service opportunities are, be they administrative or academic, I think we can, as we have success, we can start to bring more pressure to bear to say, we're wasting resources not to move in this direction. And whether it's through nudging or other kinds of friendly coercion, to really start to push laggard institutions towards that, but not starting there. So.
I have a question. I'd be interested to know what USM's strategic plan for us, Shady Grove, is. They created us. What was their long-term, I know it was created to fill in some gaps, but how did they foresee it to sustain itself in their strategic plan of Shady Grove? I'd be interested to know that, if anybody has that answer.
Ellen, you want to take a crack?
It was just, Anne, I was waiting for your cue, whether you wanted me to take that one or not. So again, Ellen Herbst, and I know Ike's on the line as well, as is PJ, as is a bunch of people who were around the system when Shady Grove was created, and I was not. But I will say that, the state has this concept of regional centers. So this is not unique to the university system. And the idea is to bring educational opportunities to place-bound students. And I won't go into the particulars of how Shady Grove itself was formed, but Shady Grove is one of 3 regional centers in the university system of Maryland. That's still the vision, that these are geographic locations that serve students that, for whatever reason, want to complete their education in the place where they are and not leave that place and go somewhere else where there's a university. And again, I can't talk to what the thinking was at the beginning about what the business model would look like. It was clearly a model based on state support through appropriations. It was this idea that there would be shared resources brought to bear. Obviously, the universities, as Mary says, bring the curriculum, the accredited programs, the professors, all of that. And Shady Grove, as well as, to a smaller extent, because they're much smaller, Southern Maryland and Hagerstown bring, to the extent they can, wraparound services. So I think the legislature, when they asked us to take a look at this comprehensively for Shady Grove, they actually knew we had started working on this. The prior chancellor had asked us to start looking at this because it was clear that whatever the original thinking was, it may not be the complete answer today for that. So I applaud the work that Anne's doing to lead this effort. And we have to come out of this with what is the sustainable model looking like. And I applaud that Anne is leading this by saying, what do we want to be and what pieces of it does Shady Grove want to do? And then we have to sell it to whoever it is we identify is going to fund various pieces of it. But I will invite others who were here at the creation of Shady Grove much before me to weigh in.
Shirley, you want to weigh in?
I wasn't here at the creation either, so I'll pause if there's anyone who wants to jump in, but it did spark a thought.
PJ? This is Mary. Are you still
I-
on?
Yes, I am. I hear you.
You're on
I'm
the
gonna be try-
Founders Plaza, so we have to pick on you.
I can honestly say that in the beginning, in the founding of USG, there wasn't a tremendous thought put into the financial model. It was founded on the basis of one, meeting the educational needs in the largest county in the state with the highest percentage of high school graduates going on to college and no four-year public university offerings in that county. It was founded because it had support. The creation of it had support from the legislature, the chancellor, the Board of Regents, and Montgomery County, and in very close working relationship with Montgomery College. I'll just say it like it is. A lot of pressure was put on individual institutional presidents by the legislature, by the system office, to bring programs to Shady Grove, to make it work. Fast forward 20 years. It's been a success, obviously, but institution. A number of you have heard me say this a million times. I keep saying it till I die. University presidents, left to their own devices, most of them, I don't want to say everyone, don't want to paint with a too broad a brush, but their number one mission is their home institution. I mean, I know we have a director from UMBC on. Look, President Dabrowski's number one mission has been the UMBC home campus. And I respect that and understand that. Now, but that being said, he has always, from day one, seen the value in bringing UMBC programs to Montgomery County. Montgomery County, as a K through 12 system, feeds UMBC. I think it's their largest feeder, and it helped him meet a number of objectives. Bringing UMBC to Montgomery County, connecting Montgomery County to UMBC. It was a win-win-win for everybody. Some other presidents have been historically brought to Shady Grove kicking and screaming. And that, in essence, has created an unsustainable fiscal model that needs to change. One last comment on, yes, somebody said, well, it's not unique as far as a higher ed regional higher ed center, but I will say that the three USM regional higher ed centers, Shady Grove, Hagerstown, and Southern Maryland. Shady Grove was the first. Hagerstown came after that because they looked at Shady Grove and said, we need more public higher ed opportunities in Washington County. Southern Maryland was already there, as like the other, I think 6 regional higher ed centers, the non-USM regional higher ed centers. Those all grew up out of their community colleges. And there was no coordination really with those other ones. And USM just recently took over the Southern Maryland one. So I hope that helps a little bit.
Thanks, PJ. Shirley, you want to jump in?
So on a slightly different point, thinking about our starting point and understanding, I want to go back to, when Rick was calling out the public good versus private good. I keep thinking that if we put the institutions behind the students, right? If we think about what Shady Grove was designed to do, was to open up this incredibly diverse community that candidly has grown poorer, has grown more diverse, but has incredible potential. And think about what the experiences from the student's part is and make it work. I was so struck by Kathy talking about being able on your phone to register for all the courses. Candidly, I've been on the board of advisors for years, and I can't quite figure out how you navigate applications to all our partner institutions. If we really want to get to an educational ecosystem where people think about MCPS to MC or maybe Frederick College to USG, can we think differently about a way where USG is the front and everything else that happens behind? But from a student perspective, it's reaching out to USG. It's having somebody wrap your hands around you. It's having the resources and the revenues flow that way. And to pick up on Rick's point, in higher education, we know students are going to have many, many, many more options. They're going to have options not to do credentials, to do things online. They're not going to need to go to brick and mortar institutions. So how do we become more responsive? How do we make it easier? And how do we think about this entire conversation about sustainability and how we want the funding to flow as if we were starting from the student experience and making that seamless in order to meet a shared goal with the system, which is to continue to grow our enrollment in an enrollment-rich county, but that is exceptionally diverse, where access to affordable and easier higher education can make a huge difference. We would just have a very different conversation. And I just keep coming back to that, particularly with some of the points that were made today. Just wanted to share.
I have another question. So recently we had an MOU signing with the universities, president of the universities. And how do we compete with universities like President Pines and the president of UMB, who are saying they're investing money in Montgomery County to create those relationships, but where does Shady Grove fit in those relationships? If they're putting their money in this county to strengthen their programs, to add new programs, how does Shady Grove fit in that when we don't have the revenue to invest in those? Well, not that I know of. We could have that revenue to invest in those partnerships and relationships between the state institution and Montgomery County. If they're going and doing it themselves, I don't know how we fit in that, to try to compete with that.
Melissa, I'll just say, I think it's an interesting question. I'll just say that it shouldn't be a competition, and it needs to be partnership. And so I don't see it as competition. I see it as a challenge for all of us, the system and USG and our partners, to build USG to be that partner in that effort. And I think it's a matter of capacity building. It's a matter of defining what these efficiencies are, what these value adds are, what the return of investment is. So I think that's the work we have to do to turn, every organization is going to do what they need to do to grow and strategically grow and do what they need to do. If we want to be more of a partner in that effort, I think it's a matter of building that capacity with the system, with our partners, so there's a shared sense of the role Shady Grove can play in that effort beyond offering programs here. And so I think there's, to Shirley's great point, wouldn't that be amazing if there was a collective effort in centering the student experience and really simplifying the student experience for enrollment, for choosing a course, choosing courses, choosing a degree program, choosing a mentor, finding a job. What if there was a way to simplify those pathways through technology and through some really creative collaborative thinking as well. So I don't see it as a competition. I think that we cannot be seen as the 13th campus in the University System of Maryland. We are a partner in the University System of Maryland, and our challenge in the strategic planning process, I believe, is to build that capacity so that we really have those genuine partnerships and centering the student experience. Others may have different view, but yeah, Steve.
So I don't know if what I have is a question or a statement, but I've always said that we, going back to it, I think PJ, you said about this being the largest county in the state and why this institution was developed. And yet we know we have this unusual model where we don't get tuition money, and we get generosity of the state to support us, really, for the most part. But we can only expect so much. And I do understand. I understand there's competing resources, but we live in a county where the whole purpose of what we do is to serve primarily, although we get some students from other counties, it's primarily to serve students coming up from Montgomery County and to create that ecosystem. So if that's the case, I just really feel we've got to get to the point where the future model provides more opportunity for there to be a county funding source as well. And people may say, well, it's a state institution and that can't happen. But I really think it's going to take some creativity to figure out what part of this institution can and should be supported by Montgomery County. Because I love the idea of us being a better business model or being innovative and finding ways to generate revenue, but we're not a business, and at some level we are an institution of public higher education. So to me, the long run has to be a little bit more of some reliance on county funding as well. I don't know how you make that happen, but that's what I have believed since I've known about USG since its creation and been a part of it going back over 20 years. But looking back, that's never really happened. It happens to some small extent, and it's been very beneficial in ACES, but even that has been patchworked and needs a more reliable funding stream from the county to support that.
That seems like it would connect well into our the conversation that we had on community wealth building back in the first workshop.
Yeah.
Thinking about a lot of these ideas, in terms of presenting what we can offer here, when you think about universities, I mean, they were originally created to be institutions of shared knowledge that benefited the public good in society, right? To the point that, artists would be patronized by the wealthy simply to create art, right? There is an intrinsic benefit to doing that work. And I think sometimes we forget to harness that idea that the ability to do research together, to collaborate together in a space is really powerful. And so I wonder if we can think about the resources this county has, as an opportunity to incentivize faculty to spend time here doing research that they can, report back to their home institution. We were able to, create a stronger research program because we had some of the barriers of space removed, and we were able to collaborate more fluidly and more effectively across institutions. I think sometimes there's a lot of focus on, building connections at the highest level. But we have really rich opportunities to, have faculty here make connections with one another, have staff make connections with staff at peer institutions, and hope that these empowering relationships trickle up and really show our benefit to, university presidents when they see their faculty, doing more innovative research or partnering with someone in Montgomery County in the industry. And doing things like that can fuel investment in our students and create more unique opportunities. And so I wonder, if there's a way to leverage the opportunities that we are able to create, not just for students, but for faculty, for research, for program directors, and really think about how that ties into not just community wealth building, but our way to show our value and contribute to the larger idea of, what it means to be an institution that ultimately is really, historically here to create this shared sense of knowledge that uplifts all of society, not just the folks who are in these buildings at these given times.
Thanks, Adam. Any other thoughts? I may ask Rick and Kathy if they wanted to share any kind of parting words of wisdom or, just kind of reflections on what we heard today. It would be great to hear from Rick and Kathy one more time, if that's okay.
Sure, I'll jump in, and Kathy, I know you'll be able to build on that. I think my key thought to everyone is this is the hard work. This is where higher ed needs to be. And I mean, every institution, every organization, every system needs to really take a hard look at what is its shared future vision? What are the resources I currently have available to drive towards that? How does that help me build towards a new business model to achieve that sustainably? And I think within that, recognizing that that is as much a data analysis resource conversation as it is a culture conversation. We are very much changing what it is we're about in higher ed. And so the courage to be bold in this moment, I think, is really essential. And so I applaud you for putting these key questions on the table. And I encourage you to keep going, with the great leadership you have to do the hard work in terms of where you want to go next.
I just I put one question out there because again, the state went through the exercise of the Kirwan Commission, and it looked at. I'm just curious as that was pre-pandemic, and whether or not those who have been closer to that document and its implementation and the funding that's around it, would you do anything differently based on where we are now versus before the pandemic demonstrated some holes to us? It'd just be interesting for us to go back and look and read that document now and what we were planning and how we were thinking about it with the context of what we're trying to do right now. Is what we're doing contrary, consistent, radical? I think it's probably worth exploration.
I agree, Kevin. I think it's worth a good look to see where Shady Grove fits into that bigger ecosystem model as well. Absolutely. Kathy, can we ask you for some closing comments?
Sure. I just have really enjoyed hearing your conversation, and you all are absolutely right. You have to figure out the situation and context that you all are working with to figure out the path forward. And it's clear from the conversation you're absolutely on track to do that. So I applaud you for that. I will say a couple of things that strike me as really interesting. I love that idea that Kevin just raised at looking at the pre-pandemic view and understanding how that may have shifted. Hearing you all talk about the importance and the purpose for being is really connected to your local community. You might think about ways in addition to just exploring revenue coming from those sources, but are there other partnership levels in terms of workforce development and those sorts of things that could be built in? And then some of the comments that were made about the student experience. I will tell you, some individuals at the colleges in New Mexico struggle with this, but the reality is student expectations around what the experience is going to look like is very different from when we were all in college. Students don't go off to college, at least in New Mexico. The vast majority of our students in community colleges are returning adults, and they don't have the luxury of going off and living in a dorm and joining a sorority and all the fun things that we did, taking a full-time load and finishing in 4 to 5 years. Their expectation is framed by Amazon and Facebook, and they love the ability to go to Amazon, pick all the things that they want from a variety of different sellers, put it in one cart. After I do it the first time, I don't even have to tell you how I'm going to pay for it. You already know. And you click a button and voila. And what we're finding is that students have those expectations around higher education. And so I love that you all are thinking about ways that universities of Shady Groves may facilitate some of that, movement to the future, whatever that may be and whatever is most relevant for your community and the students that you serve. So I just applaud you for your efforts.
Thank you, Kathy. That Amazon model is going to be hanging with us now. So that's awesome. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for your wisdom and your time and your reflection. A lot of work ahead, but this certainly opened up our eyes about how we have to approach this and how we need to think about it. So special thanks to Kathy and to Rick for your time and insight and expertise. We really appreciate it. Thanks to everybody who participated in here today. It's the last of our workshops, but just the beginning of our work. So lots ahead. Thank you so much, everybody. Take care.